Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 797, and today is May 12th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I have a lot to talk about, big news coming out over the weekend. Going to jump right into it, but I do know you will all want to listen to my interviews this week on the Kyle Anzalone Show. That will be first with Kelly Vallejos today at 4:45, and then on Wednesday with Dan McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute, again at 4:45. So be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel for the Kyle Anzalone Show. It is the first link in the show notes page wherever you're listening to this episode, and I'm just going to jump right into today's news. So starting off here with this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, Putin proposes direct talks with Ukraine. Zelensky says ceasefire must happen first. So on Sunday, Russian President Vladimir Putin proposed starting direct peace talks with Ukraine without preconditions in Turkey this Thursday. Ukrainian President Zelensky initially responded by saying there must be a ceasefire before talks could be held. He later said that he would be willing to meet with Putin in Istanbul this Thursday, but made clear that it would still be conditioned on a ceasefire. So Zelensky said, "We await a full and lasting ceasefire starting from tomorrow to provide the necessary basis for diplomacy. There is no point in prolonging the killing. And I will be waiting for Putin in Turkey on Thursday. Personally, I hope this time the Russians will not look for excuses." So in his announcement proposing the talks, Putin said that Ukraine had rejected previous Russian ceasefire offers, including a 3-day truce he declared for the Russian Victory Day, which ended at midnight on May 11th. Through the 3 days, both sides accused the other of violating the ceasefire. So I find this to be very interesting, and I think a piece of what's going on here is that both Putin and Zelensky are trying kind of their hand at what is mostly propaganda to make sure that they don't incur too much of Trump's ire. And so I think this is a part of why you have Putin declaring a short ceasefire for Easter, a short ceasefire for the Russian Victory Day, so he could point to the Ukrainian side and say, we're declaring ceasefires, but the Ukrainians aren't responding. Additionally, these short 3-day ceasefires probably don't give Ukraine a real logistical advantage as they would have if it was a 30-day ceasefire or more. You can't train new troops in 3 days. I'm sure you can get some troops to the front lines. You could get some ammo to the front lines, but generally speaking, 30 days would give the Ukrainians a massive amount of time to rearm, refortify their defenses that a limited 3-day pause isn't going to give them. So that's why I think Putin's willing to go along with these 3-day pauses. Now, I don't think it necessarily reflects poorly on the Ukrainian side or says that this is proof that Zelensky doesn't want diplomacy just because he's unwilling to engage in a unilateral ceasefire declared by Putin. Obviously, if Putin is declaring this ceasefire, he thinks it's going to work for the Russian side. And we saw on May 8th, just before the ceasefire went into effect, the Russians took not a bunch of territory, but for the slow pace that the conflict moves, they did seize some new territories on May 8th and then probably use that 3-day period to fortify those new positions and new villages and towns that they took from the Ukrainian side. And so I don't think, this is just showing one side really wants peace and the other one doesn't. I think both sides are, again, engaging in some level of, dishonesty here in the way they're trying to frame this. This is why Ukraine, after the 3-day Russian pause, comes out with this 30-day ceasefire. Again, I think this is about appealing to Donald Trump. They're trying to convince Donald Trump that, the Ukrainians really do want peace. They really do want to engage with Russians. The Russians that aren't willing to engage. And again, on both sides of this, I think you see that the ceasefires that they're proposing or declaring are really in line with their greater strategic and military objectives as well. It doesn't, at least it's not a significant setback from that perspective. And so these aren't goodwill offers. And I feel somewhat the same about these talks in Turkey. Where Putin probably wants to make it clear to Donald Trump that, look, I'm not the problem here. I'm willing to sit down and talk to anyone. I would assume that Putin understands diplomacy well enough to know that the Ukrainian and the Russian sides are very far apart here. And while, look, maybe if we're dealing with two leaders that actually could be somewhat reasonable, and I don't think Zelensky will be, maybe there is some kind of advantage here to the two sides sitting down, talking, and just figuring out, just making sure that the Ukrainians understand what the Russians want and the Russians understand what the Ukrainians are most unwilling to give up. And if that were the case, then Putin and Zelensky talking could lead to a better chance at peace. I think what really would need to happen here is lower level discussions between Russians and Ukrainians, and then building up and eventually leading to a Trump and Putin and Zelensky summit where they already know when they sit down at the table that we agree on these 5 points and we can move forward with these 5 points. And so that way the talks move in a positive direction. I don't think there's really any possibility of these talks moving in the right direction. That being said, I think it kind of worked out as a good play for Putin here because this is what Donald Trump said. So Trump said that he wanted Ukraine to accept Putin's offer for direct talks without a ceasefire. He wrote on Truth Social, President Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate a possible end to the bloodbath. Ukraine should agree to this immediately. At least they will be able to determine whether or not a deal is possible, and if it is not, European leaders and the US know where everything stands and can proceed accordingly. Despite Trump's post, Zelensky says he expects the ceasefire to begin on Monday. Starting tomorrow, we await a ceasefire. This proposal is on the table, and a full and unconditional ceasefire, one that lasts long enough to provide a necessary foundation for diplomacy, could significantly bring peace. Now, I do wonder if it would be a good idea if these talks were to happen on Thursday for Russia and Ukraine to end the fighting on Wednesday night. I know that especially in the US and in the Western press, if the fighting is ongoing as Putin and Zelensky sit down, BBC, France 24, Washington Post, New York Times, all these, establishment media outlets, I could write the headlines now. Putin bombs Ukraine while meeting with Zelensky. Putin is looking Zelensky in the face while he's killing Ukrainians. And, this is just going to be the rhetoric around it. And so if Putin wants these talks to be successful and even a successful PR stunt, it would probably be wise to at least try to curtail the Russian operations as much as possible while these talks are ongoing. And if there's any possibility that these talks would be successful and lead to something greater, if they declare a ceasefire, say on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday before the talks begin, maybe Putin and Zelensky could agree to extend that ceasefire by 12 hours. And at least then there's some kind of positive statement that could come out of the summit between the two leaders. It would be a trivial token move. It would be purely symbolic. However, those kind of things can get the ball rolling in the right direction when it comes to diplomacy. And so, some kind of pause in the fighting may be good, but again, I think a lot of this, what's going on in both Kiev and Moscow, is a lot of theater directed at Washington, where the Ukrainians want to convince Trump to keep sending weapons, to keep Joe Biden's proxy war going, and the Russians, I think, are at least hoping that they convince Trump that Zelensky is the real barrier to peace, and that if Trump wants to move forward, the best path for him is just to cut Zelensky loose. All right. Next up here. So these are the two really big stories I want to talk about today. Hamas says it will release US-Israeli citizen Edan Alexander. Hamas said on Sunday that it will release Edan Alexander, a dual U.S.-Israeli citizen and IDF soldier who was captured during the October 7th attack, and confirmed that it had been in direct talks with the U.S. on a potential Gaza ceasefire deal and the entry of humanitarian aid into the Palestinian territory. So Hamas official Dr. Khalil al-Hayya said, according to Jobsite News, as a part of the efforts being made by our mediators mediator brothers to achieve a ceasefire. Hamas has been in contact with the U.S. administration over the past few days. The movement has expressed a high degree of positivity in the release of Israeli soldier Idan Alexander, a dual U.S. citizen, will be a part of the steps being taken to achieve a ceasefire, open the crossings, and allow aid and relief to reach our people in the Gaza Strip. So according to Axios, Steve Witkoff spoke with Alexander's parents and told them he should be released soon. Israeli media is reporting that a Hamas official said Alexander would be released on Monday at noon. President Trump confirmed the deal in a statement on Truth Social, saying, "Hopefully this is the first of those final steps necessary to end this brutal conflict. I look very much forward to the day of celebration." The office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Hamas will release Idan Alexander without any compensation or conditions as a gesture of goodwill towards the U.S., adding the U.S. conveyed to Israel this move is expected to lead to negotiations for the release of additional hostages and based on the original Witkoff framework, which Israel has already accepted. And so let's kind of get in and break this down, because this is being reported as being a part of a major shift in Washington, the White House policy towards Israel. And, my instincts are to dismiss it. Look, Israel has a lot of influence in the United States, a lot of influence in Mar-a-Lago. And so the idea that Trump is going to pull the plug on U.S. assistance to Israel seems crazy. That being said, there are some reasons that I do think that this has to at least be addressed and considered if maybe we're really moving in the direction where even if the U.S. doesn't stop provide Israel with military assistance, the U.S. is going to start applying some pressure on Israel to end this conflict. So what could be going on here? And I just want to start this off because part of my instincts say that this may be theater from Trump and Netanyahu, and basically they're just trying to get Hamas to give up more of the hostages because Hamas is going to think they have a opening to split Tel Aviv from Washington, and if they release some hostages, they're going to get goodwill from Washington. They're going to show Trump, again, almost in like a situation we're talking about in the Ukrainian war. They're trying to prove something to Donald Trump, and they're trying to show Donald Trump that, hey, Netanyahu is the real barrier to peace here. He's the real problem when it comes to these negotiations. And we're actually fairly reasonable and willing to work with you, and we want a very reasonable outcome to this. There's reports saying that Trump is willing to allow Hamas to remain in control as an armed group in Gaza post-conflict. There's reports that Netanyahu said we may have to wean or detox ourselves from American military support. And look, if those statements really reflect what direction the policy moves in, then that's massive. That's huge. I'm just very skeptical of it at this point. Now, I do think Idan Alexander will probably be released here unless Israel ends up killing him. I think the Israelis, if they are very worried about the U.S. changing their policy and really reorienting their policy, killing Idan and then blaming it on Hamas would probably be the most effective way to do that. However, I think that maybe he will end up getting released here. Maybe some other hostages will be released. There will be a small amount of aid and a little bit of drawdown of the Israeli fighting in Gaza. But overall, I guess I see this kind of being like the initial, as they say, the Witkoff framework, which is Israel doesn't really have to give up anything. They're going to maybe release some Palestinian captives in exchange for the release of Israeli captives, but many of those end up getting rearrested or killed later in Gaza. And so it's not exactly like, they're putting a bunch of fighters on the battlefield or something like that. A lot of these people are just political prisoners, essentially, who do end up getting rearrested at the end of all this. And so if you look at the effects of the first ceasefire agreement, some more aid got into Gaza, but now Israel has cut off aid for so long that the Palestinians are once again in starving and famine condition. They released some Palestinian prisoners, but some of those have already been killed. Others have already been rearrested. And during that time, they rescued like 36 of their hostages, people who can no longer be held in Gaza at, as leverage against Tel Aviv. And so I think it's very possible that really what's going on here is Washington and Tel Aviv are playing Hamas to get more of the hostages out before Israel moves ahead with their major ground operation here, which is likely going to see the deaths of any remaining hostages in Gaza, as well as tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and ultimately the ethnic cleansing of the Strip. One of the real reasons I don't see this really moving in the direction of a permanent ceasefire, of what we're hearing, like the U.S. breaking its relationship with Israel, Trump being mad at Netanyahu and all of this, is because ultimately Israel has dominance here. Unless the U.S. is willing to go to war with Israel, then Israel is going to do what they want to do in Gaza. And I don't think there's anything that Donald Trump could really do about that at this point. He's already sent them all the bombs, all the weapons they need. I mean, maybe if he was really trying to play hardball, turn off intelligence assistance, stop sending like repair parts for Israeli planes and things like, maybe if we're talking about really changing the dynamic of the U.S. and Tel Aviv relationship. But if that starts to happen, I imagine Congress is going to start drafting bills, and they're going to start strong-arming the president into sending this military aid to Ukraine. And look, we do live in a post-constitutional, I think in all effective ways, United States now. And so it's not like I'm saying that Congress has ultimate authority over foreign policy and can force the executive to do what they want. However, I do think the rare times that Congress does stand up and they say, no, you must do this, and that must is sending more weapons, staying involved in a war, then the presidents tend to at least act as if their hands are tied and say that we have to go along with this. Where power actually lies now is in a lot of ways just all about perception. And so if Congress perceives they have the power to force the president to send weapons to Ukraine, and the American media goes along with this and says that, they absolutely do, in that case, I think Trump is going to face an immense amount of pressure that he'll likely cave to force, the sale of weapons, spare parts, and things like that to Israel. And if that's the case, then Israel, again, maintains dominance when it comes to Gaza, and there's nothing Trump can really do to force Netanyahu to stop this. So I'm very skeptical that we are moving towards an end to what's going on in Gaza, unless, of course, when we say that, it's just the end in the sense of Israeli victory, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. I don't think Hamas is going to get a deal from Trump. All right, next up here. UN agencies condemned US-Israel plan to use aid as bait to force Palestinians to head south. So UN aid agencies have condemned a US and Israeli plan to use aid as bait to forcibly displace Palestinian civilians into a small area of southern Gaza. So, U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee unveiled the plan on Friday, although there is no clear timeline, and Gaza remains under total Israeli blockade, pushing millions of civilians into starvation. Huckabee said the effort will be headed by a newly formed private foundation, and the aid distribution will be carried out by private U.S. security contractors. He said 4 aid distribution sites would be established and administered by the program, would initially feed about 1.2 million people, or 60% of Gaza's population. When pressed on the lack of a plan to feed the rest of the Palestinian population, Huckabee said it would be scaled up over time. An Israeli official speaking with the Times of Israel said Israel hoped other countries would begin taking in Palestinians to minimize the need for aid, meaning Israel intends to use the threat of starvation to push for ethnic cleansing. The Times of Israel report also said that 4 aid distribution sites will be set up south of the Morag Corridor, a strip of land Israel has seized that is just north of the southern city of Rafah. Under its plans to escalate the assault on Gaza, Israel wants to concentrate all of Gaza's civilian population into this tiny area. Once Palestinians are forcibly concentrated into the south, Israel would then pressure them to leave Gaza, although it's unclear where they would go. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said the Gazan citizens will be concentrated in the south. They will be totally despairing, understanding that there is no hope and nothing to look for in Gaza, and it will be looking for relocation and a new life in other places. James Elder, the spokesman for the UN Palestinian Relief Agency, or UNRWA, said establishing the aid distribution centers in the south would give Palestinians the impossible choice between displacement and death. He said the plan contravenes basic humanitarian principles and appears designed to reinforce control over life, sustaining items such as a pressure tactic. So UNRWA said it has thousands of trucks ready to deliver aid to Gaza, but they continue to be blocked by Israel. Elder explained there is a simpler alternative: lift the blockade, let the humanitarian aid in, and save lives. And so the fact that the U.S. is still going along with this plan, again, makes me very skeptical that Israel and the U.S. are actually divided on the issue when it comes to Gaza, that there's a real division between Trump and Netanyahu, and that we're moving closer towards a ceasefire that's going to allow the Palestinians to stay in Gaza with at least enough meaningful rebuilding and aid that it's not people just living in famine and squalor and the population slowly dying off. Now, one more thing I want to mention all of this is I do wonder if there's a power play going on in Tel Aviv, and this power play could move the Israeli government in a harder right direction. Let's not forget that Itamar Ben-Gvir was just running around Mar-a-Lago and Capitol Hill with Republican leadership, and to some of the statements he made sounded an awful lot like he had eyes on a very big prize in Tel Aviv, saying that he wants Congress to know who he is, and that, they're establishing a relationship for the future and things like that. I do wonder if Ben-Gvir thinks that maybe there's a pathway for him or somebody further to the right of Netanyahu to take over here, and that while this is a split between Netanyahu and Trump, maybe there's a chance here that there's no change in Washington's support for Tel Aviv, even if Tel Aviv's new government is more radical than the current one. All right. So Israeli strikes on Gaza kill 68 Palestinians over 3 days. Israeli attacks on Gaza have killed at least 68 Palestinians and wounded 290 others over the past 3 days, according to daily death toll updates released by the Gaza Health Ministry. In that same period of time, at least 2 bodies of Palestinians killed in previous attacks were recovered from the rubble. And so this pushes the death toll since October 7th, 2023 to 52,829, although there was a recent study by the Lancet that is talking about direct deaths from conflict. So they're not even talking about indirect deaths here. And they say that number is now between, I think, 70 and 110,000. So obviously that this official number, this is a list of the bodies they've recovered, of the people they've recovered. We know that people have been completely obliterated and wiped off the face of the earth by multiple Israeli 2,000-pound bombs. We know tens, if not more, bodies are buried beneath the rubble of Gaza, that Palestinians have been killed by Israelis and left for their bodies to be consumed by dogs and ripped apart and things like that. People who will never be counted, never be recorded. And so the death toll is certainly higher than the 52,829. But the Lancet is saying it could be twice as high, which of course would certainly push the number of indirect deaths well into the mid probably hundreds of thousands, 200,000, 300,000, 400,000. So important to remember too that when Trump took office, he was saying that there was, I think, between like 1.5 and 1.8 million Palestinians in Gaza, which is between, I guess, like 7 and 500,000 lower than the estimated population of the enclave before the Israeli attack. And so maybe Trump had information that we didn't, that the death toll is absolutely monumental at this point. And maybe that's why Mike Huckabee thinks they only need food for 1.2 million Palestinians. All right, Pope Leo the 14th calls for peace in Gaza and end to the Israeli blockade of aid. I think this is a good sign that this Pope is going to be somebody who brings a message of peace, similar to his predecessor Pope Francis. We will, see how things develop over time. This was just his first major speech. All right. Iran says fourth round of talks with the U.S. was difficult but useful. So Iran on Sunday said that the fourth round of negotiations they held with the U.S. earlier in the day were difficult but useful, and both sides have agreed to hold more talks. So the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman wrote on X, the fourth round of indirect U.S.-Iranian talks is concluded, difficult but useful talks for a better understanding of each other's positions and to find reasonable and realistic ways to address these differences. Next round will be coordinated and announced by Oman. A U.S. official told Axios that the agreement was reached on moving forward and working the technical details of a potential nuclear deal. He said, "We are encouraged by today's outcome and look forward to our next meeting, which will happen in the near future." Now, behind the scenes, we get reports after these talks that they're going well, that we're understanding each other's positions better, we're moving closer to a deal. But then publicly, the statements from the Trump administration certainly cross Iranian red lines. And, there's two possibilities here. I think for sure, whatever message the U.S. is relaying to Iran behind the scenes is different from the public position that the American administration is taking. Now, there could be multiple reasons for this. One is to mislead the Iran hysterics in the United States because, maybe Trump feels if he could make a deal with the Iranians, roll it out relatively quickly, then he could tie Congress's hands and the deal's already in place before they could act. Again, we're post-constitutional, so I don't think this is like 2015 where Trump actually has to go to Congress to get authorization on a nuclear deal with Iran. That being said, if Trump is saying we're going to allow Iran to continue to enrich uranium to 3.67% or whatever it is, Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, John Fetterman, Chuck Schumer, the Democrats and the Republicans, bipartisan, are going to have a collective meltdown. Their heads are going to explode, and they're going to start passing legislation, new sanctions on Iran. Sanctions on Iran cannot be lifted unless there's no nuclear enrichment program in Iran. All these additional conditions will be applied, and it will effectively kill diplomacy. And so it could be that Trump is taking that path where he's trying to deceive and mislead the American hearts. I worry that they're presenting a more reasonable position behind the scenes to the Iranians, but their real position is what they're stating publicly, which is that Iran will not have a nuclear enrichment program if they want to deal with the U.S. Now, part of me says, look, they could keep talking because if they could talk for 4 years, that means they don't go to war. And eventually we will figure this out with maybe a more realistic American administration that we're just not going to see with the Trump administration. And so a prolonged period of talks could be what we need to just kind of get through the Trump administration without going to war with Iran. I don't think he's going to have the political courage to take the deal that needs to be taken to get a nuclear deal signed with Iran. Of course, no deal has to be signed at all. Iran isn't making nuclear weapons. That's why I think we could go down this road of negotiations for 4 years, so long as the Trump administration doesn't decide to draw a red line saying that, you have 2 weeks or we're going to start bombing Iran. As long as they don't say that, as long as we keep negotiating, Iran's not building a bomb. There's really, I don't think, a downside to just keeping these talks going situation, even if the two sides really aren't moving closer to a deal at this point, until either the talks fizzle and then the threat of war is over because things have calmed down in the Middle East, or Trump is moving out of office and we have a new president coming in who may be a little bit more reasonable on the Iran issue. But for Trump to make a deal with Iran, I think that deal is going to have to include Iran being able to enrich uranium to some level. And of course, that is essentially the Obama nuclear deal that Trump withdrew from in 2018. And Iran is probably going to ask and demand a better deal this time around than the last time, because the Americans dropped out of that in 2018. And the Iranians really, I think, probably and rightfully so, feel they got screwed on the first nuclear deal and won't be interested in entering into a second one unless it's a little bit stronger from their perspective. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Again, subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. You don't want to miss my interview today with Kelly Vallejos.